Oh, no, you just love Teams. There we go. Okay. So, so I thought we'd talk a little bit about why we care about this concept of authoritative. I mean, we talk about it all the time, but it's probably good to kind of remind ourselves why we think it's important. And then there's a bunch of terms: authoritative, trusted, endorsed, system of record. I want to kind of talk through some of those. And then I was reflecting back on some of the old data standards that we have, like back in the day when the Forest Task Group was in place and we were working on those different standards. One of the things that we had done on those was we had, authoritative data source, and we named applications. And I think that with Irwin and our understanding of our data, we recognize that the same data exists in multiple systems, and that we've determined that some systems are authoritative for that data and others aren't, even if they contain that data. And so I think it's kind of interesting to think about it, the data versus the system, and they're highly related but helpful. And then interagency versus agency, and then endorsed versus authoritative. So these are kind of concepts that we talk about, and I just think we'll walk through them. So I'd like to hear from you guys. Why do we think this concept is important? What is having authoritative data or authoritative systems do for us, and why would we value this type of concept?
Reporting.
Emmy?
I am personally, there's so much data out there, and you can search for data that you're interested in. And if you don't have any badge on it or anything to say what data is good or what's bad, you don't know what to trust. So having a data set marked authoritative for at an enterprise level, for me, is really helpful.
Okay. I'm going to let Dawn, if you can help me through the hands up, that would be helpful.
Sure. Cole was next in line.
Yeah, sorry, Andrew, I beat you. I think it's important that we, are all pointing at the same data for our reporting. So whether it's, right, wrong, or not perfect, that as a group that we're all, pointing to the same data sources to, upward report, and be consistent. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think that authoritative tag helps ensure that the data are fit for the purpose that they're going to be used for. And so to me, authoritative, I always ask authoritative for what? Authoritative for answering interagency questions, authoritative for answering agency questions, authoritative for scientific application. There can be differences there, and there's nuance, but knowing that something's been tagged authoritative by a group for a purpose is important.
Thanks, Andrew. Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to say enables standardization and best practices, which I think we're increasingly finding is just going to be much more important going forward with all of the automation that's happening.
That's all the hands.
All right. I think that's a pretty good list. And I think, it's in thinking about it, pausing and thinking about it, it becomes, we can look at it and go, well, duh, that's obvious, but sometimes it isn't as obvious as we think. And so it's good to kind of step back and look at how we use this. I think, we kind of talked on the standardizations and best practices. I think it's also interoperability. And I spell and talk at the same time. No. So I think that's another component of it. It facilitates that collaboration. Will?
Yeah, I think one of the key aspects of authoritative data is you go to one source for that information. I'll pull an example of region forest district lists within the Forest Service. We tend to have multiple systems duplicating that list instead of having one list that is authoritative. So it's a good example of why authoritative data matters. It reduces duplication.
Kara?
I think you might have already got this, and so just maybe I think it kind of just speaks to the efficiencies. We don't have to spend so much time and waste so much time questioning the validity of the information, that we know for sure it's trusted and it's good. So I think it's kind of just a combination of what everybody has already said. But I think efficiency and the time wasted for me and having to go to so many sources. I know for sure where to go when I want this data.
BJ?
I think one of the things that ties kind of think to the second bullet, but it's that when analysis are done, multiple analysis can be done that come to different answers. And if the data isn't the same, you can't discern the complexities that are out there to try to get not going to say the right answer, but I'm going to say the answer that makes most sense.
And I'll wait a little bit so you can type. But Kara, you got another one?
I do. I was just thinking credibility, which kind of really tears off of what BJ was saying, but just, we as an organization, if we're showing, based on whatever project we're working on, different information, different data, and then we've got, our internal and external partners, media, the public, et cetera, seeing those inconsistencies, we lose our credibility.
John?
Yeah, so I'm kind of hung up on this concept of, gosh, it wouldn't be great if we had a catalog of all that stuff of our authoritative data, so that when a new system or anybody that's interested in finding out about our data, they actually have a place to go, and it tells them what and why the data is there, how it's used, and things like that. So there is a universal list, but also, every one of our systems, we keep recreating all the same data, and don't get on my same little horn. Gosh, it'd be nice if we had a list that just showed me agency. What agency is an authoritative list for all the agencies or all the departments. And all those kinds of things, because we're just recreating them in all our systems because we'd like to know who you are, who you work for, where you go. But at least all the systems I've worked on, most of them we're just creating that ourselves. So I just want to be able to share that data, find out where it is, and not recreate it. Because we also know that folks still go to the systems they're comfortable with to pull data. And I know that I've got some bad data on agencies in one of my systems, and having somebody pull it from there, I don't make it readily available, but they can pull it because I have an interactive grid that they can sort and filter by agency. And it's kind of embarrassing when you see the Forest Service spelled 4 different ways and things like that. So I think it gives us credibility, but it can also, open up us to be better at sharing. So thanks.
Thanks, John.
Why do you always have to call it the Forest Service, John?
Yeah, well, it's always that thing that you guys think like your regions. I still never know your regions, and I've only been around for a little while, and I still think of things like states and directions and not region 5, region 2.
All right. And back to you, Kara, but also I want to call out Rebecca Harnett had a good little piece in the chat.
Yeah,
Looking-
this is Rebecca Harnett. Yeah, I've dealt with this issue for a long time, and where I've consistently landed is focusing on best available data, because the most authoritative source is very subjective depending on who you're talking to. And what we found is just because a source is the most authoritative doesn't always mean that it's the best available.
Or the most current, yeah.
And so, yeah, we've really focused, and I've taken this kind of throughout and into NERIS and everything else, of really emphasizing best available. And we can define best available, right? It's the most accurate, it's the most reliable, and it's the most timely. And so if we focus on accuracy, reliability, and timeliness of data, that's more important than claiming a source as authoritative. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kara, was your hand still up?
I was just thinking about my dear friend John Oneman and how he puts this plug in. And I just also want to say, and accessible to his line, that we have a catalog of authoritative, which developers could use, and get the same for the ease of development, et cetera, but it's also accessible. We struggle with that too.
Good follow-up. Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to add a thought to what John said as well, because we've tried to build catalogs, and we've had folks go, look at it, decide that it's not good enough, and go do their own thing. So I would like to introduce the concept of feedback loops that we need to define feedback loops for our authoritative data, so that when the data doesn't meet a specific purpose, we can actually work on that as a group, rather than just go build another one-off. And before you know it, we've got different concepts of authoritativeness, of usefulness, and we never actually end up improving our authoritative data.
Lots of applause for that one.
Yeah, I agree with that one too, because a lot of times, yeah, there's just a disagreement and then the progress stops. But if we can continue to improve the list, then that's where I think we'll find success.
Nice.
Yeah, and we're never gonna probably build the Goldilocks for everybody, the perfect bed for everyone. But
Because you're so sensitive, Cole.
but we need to land on something that works for a majority of our applications, and our users. That's what it is. I mean, there's always going to be people that want something slightly different, but we need to try to minimize that, like Andrew said, and John, of people recreating the wheel all the time, because we aren't going to have the money or the time to do that probably going forward.
Thanks.
I think
EJ?
I was going to say that I think to expand on what Andrew was saying, much like in fire, we have a time lag for our fuel moistures. We also have a time lag for the data and the quality of the data, right? Some of it's going to be good into perpetuity, but others, it is going to change over time. And so, how do you track that, and keep it relevant? It goes back to that feedback loop that Andrew was hitting on, and it's that time lag for the data.
Yeah, BJ, I think that's one of those things that, like, you know, if I could have everything that I could possibly imagine, right, we would have this really nice way of documenting the state of the data so that people could understand, like if they wanted to run a query that was, I want to know the last 5 years up till today, right? They would know that maybe the data that they're looking at for today isn't quite as reliable as the data that they're looking at for a year ago, right? And that's, you know, just finding ways to be able to communicate that information about the state and the status of the data and the records and all of that is important.
Yeah, I just a little bit on that. I think, you know, there's certain things that we are always going to have agencies. We're always going to have administrative boundaries. What is the time frame of that update? I think if somebody that's doing an analysis knows that on an annual basis, this thing is going to be accurate, that helps. But then there's other things like financial data or whatnot that, you know, you have different rules in place, 7 years, 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, and perpetuity type things, right? And those are going to have a different age. You know, it's kind of like, how fast does that fruit that you just bought at the store rot? Some of it you need to use right away. Some of it it's gonna hold for quite a while. A turnip in a basement in a sandbox is gonna be there for a while, as opposed to eggs sitting on the counter. You know.
Yeah. All right, this is a great list. You guys are always impressive. What I want to do is take a look at some definitions. And so I will tell you that, you know, my first place that I go is the DMBOK, the Data Management Body of Knowledge. And it's really interesting to me that what DMBOK defines and what it doesn't. Oh, my slides didn't change. Why did that happen? Why there's a lag on this? I'm on the network. It shouldn't lag. Okay, there we go. So, so within the federal system of record has an official meaning, but what's interesting to me, and it was a nuance that I don't know if I knew or if I just had forgotten or just hadn't registered clearly, but so if we look at the Privacy Act of '74, it requires a system of record notice in the Federal Register for systems that contain Privacy Act data. And so I know that we've talked about this concept of system of record for a long time, and it's been one that I have been personally a little cautious about just because of that requirement for a SORN and what it really means to be a system of record. And so I think that as we kind of look through some of these definitions that I pulled up, that we can see why it is that we kind of use some of these terms interchangeably, and because there are some very nuanced differences. But I do think that it is important when we're talking about the federal systems to recognize that that system of record designation does have a really specific connotation because of the SORN and the Privacy Act. And so just kind of putting that in the bucket to let it float for a minute and see kind of what that does. DMBOK has a definition for a system of record. And I love that they use like an authoritative system, right? And it's like, okay. I think though that the thing that I like about the DMBOK definition is the created or maintained through a defined set of rules and expectations. So I think that that's probably part of what we're looking for when we're looking at authoritative. I liked this term system of reference. I thought that was kind of an interesting concept. And I was thinking about Irwin in particular when I read that, right? That I think that we've in the past been really careful to say Irwin isn't an authoritative data source, but we treat it like it is, I think, in use quite a bit. And so, if we can think of a way that we can describe that, that might be helpful for us instead of just locking in on the term authoritative. Trusted source is another one that Dembach uses. And I think that's kind of what Rebecca was pointing at, right? The best version of the truth. And then I went to my good friend ChatGPT because it's just fun and get some interesting stuff. So where Dembach doesn't define authoritative data source, ChatGPT brought up this concept of trusted data source, and gave a definition for authoritative data source as well. And so I think, you know, again, these are kind of nuanced between them, but I think the thing I liked about the trusted and the way ChatGPT brought it back, right, is based on the reputation of the organization, historical performance, and its adherence to certain data management standards. Whereas authoritative, it was pointing towards this idea of, because it comes from a position of expertise or official status or somebody that has primary responsibility, right? So those are to me meaningful differences, and ones that might kind of help us as we think through this. And then, oh, that's the next one. So, so I just kind of wanted to, I could have probably put them all on one slide. That might have been easier to compare them, but just wanted to kind of put those out there and see, does any of that resonate? Anything strike you in thinking about these concepts or these terms as a way of defining what we have and what's important to understand about our data?
To your point of system of record has important meaning on the federal side, does it make sense that, lack of a better term, I don't know, maybe to keep it simple, would it be prudent just to say, instead of system of record on the wildfire, would you just say it's authoritative? Oh, I get where we're going. I'm going the applications here. Never mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was going to say authoritative record and authoritative reference, but that doesn't define, I think where you were going with this was the actual application. Where do you go to get it type thing? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, and maybe it'd be helpful to pop to authoritative system or authoritative source versus authoritative data, because I do think there's a little bit of difference in that, and maybe talking through that first would help with that. So let's see what Steve and Andrew have to say. Steve?
I think I'm following your lead. So, you know, it feels to me like authoritativeness probably resides in, you know, some of the things that we talk about a lot with the data management committee, like, you know, standards and oversight and, you know, other things that kind of assure something about the data, not so much the system perhaps, but the data. That idea of a system, you know, I feel like we paint ourselves in a corner frequently because we get hung up on like the name of the application as opposed to the function or the business area that it serves or the data set that it is ultimately accountable to compile. So I like authoritative, where perhaps there could be multiple systems of record. All of them could be authoritative if they adhere to standards and have, you know, some good housekeeping stamps of approval on them. Whereas, you know, a system of record itself could just fit within that authoritative umbrella, and those come and go, you know, as things get updated and replaced. I'm guessing that might be where you go. So authoritativeness might refer more to the data set and then also to maybe oversights for systems.
Yeah, I think that we in the past have conflated authoritative data and authoritative data sources, and that we that probably hasn't served us, might actually have created some confusion. And so, but they're so closely related, right? And so it is kind of a bit of a nuance. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm probably walking around the same patch of trees on the other side as Steve. I'm thinking about our fuels data and how, we just switched in Fish and Wildlife Service from FMIS to IFPERS. And so we changed our system of record. That's the system that we manage the data in, and we managed our old data in FMIS, and we managed the new data in IFPERS. And at the moment, there really is not, like, if I try to explain to a manager or another analyst, how do you get a Fish and Wildlife Service data set to do fuels analysis, I lose them about the time I start talking about going to two different systems to get the same kind of data and merge it together into, as soon as you're talking about merging something on your own desktop, you're not really, no one believes that you've got authoritative data anymore. So even though we've got two authoritative systems of record, we don't really have a system of reference or a trusted data source unless you count our SharePoint. So I don't know if that's I like to think in examples to get a little more concrete with some of the stuff.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Andrew. It's helpful.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. And this is somewhat related, but doesn't get specific. It is sort of like system of record or, information of record. But as a couple of you might remember, back in 2024, we developed a series of FEMA USFA current wildfire activity dashboard series, which was a request from our senior leadership. And what we found out was that, like, the information that is considered to be like the most authoritative, like, system of record information comes off the IMSR, right? And yet the data that we have and that we rely on, the WFIGS current interagency fire perimeters data, is obviously more current. And so it's not reporting the same information between the two different sources. And internally at, like, the FEMA administrator level, they understood the differences, but it did pose challenges internally with our, like, watch center using the IMSR versus our dashboard reporting different information than what was in the IMSR, because the IMSR is out of date since it's a static report. Anyhow, I share this because these are some of the challenges that we've run into with some of this.
I remember that well.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, right, that I don't know that I would agree that the authoritative source of the information is the IMSR, especially since it's not integrated, right, with any of the data. And so you certainly wouldn't have the most current, and you're more susceptible to the user errors. Remember the fat finger day of supposed to be 1,500 acres and somebody entered in 1,500 fires. So it's interesting. Again, it kind of takes us back to what we were talking about before, the knowledge of where you really should look.
Well, and then go ahead, Cole.
I was going to say, sorry. We had a similar conversation to this yesterday, Kara.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that it's, I think that our data systems have matured and evolved, but we haven't necessarily matured and evolved our ideas about the records. What's an authoritative record, or it's hard to kind of parse it apart. And so don't know that I have the words right to explain it yet, but, like, is IMSR the most authoritative source? Like, I think that the fact that we don't have a way of really labeling things and communicating that information out to people, then it's easy for assumptions to get made, right? And people make different assumptions because of their experience and background and history, and so, you know, I think that getting clear about what we mean when we talk about authoritativeness, which is what, to quote Steve Larrabee, I love that word, authoritativeness. You know, if we had a better sense of like, what do these various terms mean that communicate information about that data or that record? And I probably should have put something in here on data versus record, because I think we conflate data and records as well, which causes problems for us. And then if we had a way of actually labeling these things, right? To say, yes, IMSR is trusted, but it's not authoritative, or it's authoritative and this is trusted, right? Like that would actually help us be clear and help us communicate to users outside of our community and probably within our community about what we as the data management professionals, along with the business, have identified as the state or the quality of the data. John?
Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about IMSR, you know, that's always makes me cringe, because a lot of that data is based on 209, and 209 is a communications tool.
Yeah.
Most of us have recognized it is not a precise, perfect data. Some people like to think of it as, but when you look at percent contained and some of those, like, holy cow, look at that. You can 49.7%. Yeah, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the calculated percent contained, because we already know that the ICs have discretion on what they put and how they do it. So my only concern is that when we need to be able to explain to folks that the IMSR has its data, but it's derivative of another system, and that other system has inherent errors because it's subjective, not objective. And then, so if somebody's building their information on the IMSR, once again, we have 3 different layers, and each one of them may have, you know, an error level that we've just tripled and quadrupled or exponentially more because, you know, it's so far out of whack. So I really think it's not just a matter of identifying, because the 209 is the authoritative source, or the you know, I like the concept maybe of trusted source because the other ones have something, but whatever that is. But, you know, we have to have our level of confidence in that data, of which pieces of that data, you know, I'm more confident maybe in the, you know, the observed weather and some of those pieces. But boy, you give me some of the acreage and some of the percent contained and some of those things, you know, that's bad data, because folks are really very, very subjective, and folks are using it in ways that was never anticipated. You know, the forest study showed a lot of that, when EPA was using our data to determine non-attainment for a, you know, a chemical plant, you know, and using our data on what days burned and what contributed from the wildland fire. Holy cow, that once again, the 209 data it's not necessarily today, it's not necessarily yesterday. Many times it's 2 or 3 days away, and none of the people that use that data know that. So we have to be able to communicate our level of confidence in each of the data elements that are presented in there. So anyways, that's my 2 cents.
So John, do you think that 209 is authoritative? Like, if we just look at these definitions, right, would you call it authoritative, or would you call it trusted?
Well, once again, it's going to depend on the data element, because for some it is the official, you know, report for that day. So like I said, I see weather observations and some of those, because we usually get those from an IMAT. Now, granted, it's a representative weather point for a fire that, of course, can have so many different microclimates and things like that. That, I mean, is it really that much? But I'm not so sure. I would say from an acreage standpoint and the other, that the level of confidence has to show that maybe it's only 60%. So it's the best we may have for the moment that we're presenting it. but that context has to be on what day it was calculated or what day it was determined, because we infrared, well, same thing. Was it, how many days old is that? I mean, there's so many pieces on that we have to be able to explain to that. So I think somebody said it's the best we may have for that time, but I'd almost rather rely for those kind of data elements, on the NIFC open data source, because people are actually putting actual perimeters from the GIS side of the house. But yeah, I mean, it's not a simple answer. It has to go by data elements, and it's no different than fire code. Just because it has 25 data elements, only one of them technically is authoritative, is the truth, of that moment, but the others are available. So yeah, I don't see how we can resolve it at the application, or even, because that's a form, at that level.
Yeah. Any other thoughts there?
Rochelle, there's been some heavy traffic in the chat on this issue. Just
Yeah,
as a
but I
point
think,
of
I think we
reference,
want to
yeah.
be really careful about, we're trying to talk about examples, not hone in on this particular topic, I think, because as folks have pointed out, there are some politics behind some of these products that we're delivering, and there is some history behind it. The point is, what we're talking about is authoritative data sources and people making assumptions of what is an authoritative data source, which might be as you said, best available at the current time, sort of discussion. So I just think we need to be careful about honing in on one specific topic instead of staying higher into the higher overarching concept that we're trying to address.
Yeah, I would think about this conversation more as, can we define the buckets that we would then sort data into? And what makes sense, what type of label that we would put on that bucket that makes sense to us in being able to communicate our confidence in the data and how we would expect people to use it. And so until we have the buckets and the labels figured out, then we're going to be going back and forth about the specific examples. And so talking about examples is helpful to maybe define the boundaries of those buckets, but not because we're sorting right now. We're really just kind of trying to think about, is there one bucket? Are there 5 buckets? How can we discern between those buckets in ways that would actually be meaningful to address some of the issues about understanding the data? Nick?
Yeah, and I hope this is not off track, Rochelle. But when I work with researchers and they're looking at fire occurrence data, fire spread data, it's 209s or Karen's FPA FOD, they get in there and start noticing things. And I have to sit them down. I'm like, all right, now it's time for the talk. And I do think clearing that up ahead of time without, I don't know if this is a right way to say it, without airing some of the kind of dirty laundry of how things really work. But we do need something, because people think, oh, this is the data set that they make decisions off of. This is probably the best thing that's out there. And it's, it might not be perfect, but it's the best. And I don't think we've been very clear, unless you have that kind of personal communication with researchers or someone that's on the project who knows, to be like, hey, there are definitely caveats. And I think, some of the papers that Karen has been a part of and others to shed some light on that has helped. But I do think so many people entering fire research that doesn't always get caught, and then people make leaps of faith or assumptions because there's a little bit of a vacuum in terms of what that data actually represents and what it should be used for, as John said.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, Nick.
I was going to expand on Nick's comment there, and I think he's right. There's for those in this room right now that deal with this data every day, we can look at something and say, "Oh, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to go do a little more digging to find out what's really going on here. I'll go back to WFIGS, or I'll go somewhere and I'll QA/QC this thing because it's important to me." But with, again, the big authoritative stamp on a data set, it implies something to people that maybe they aren't aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have been thinking about for some time, especially in relationship to IDME, is this idea of agency authoritative and interagency authoritative. And I think that that's another place that we kind of get ourselves hung up, is that blending, right? And I do think over the years, in my mind at least, it's kind of been solidifying that we actually need to think about and manage the interagency data differently than the agency data, and that we probably should be thinking about how comfortable we are with differences between agency and interagency data. I think the Inform group probably in the fire reporting subcommittees has been wrestling with this for some time. It feels maybe a little cleaner on the GIS side, but I'm not sure why I would say that. Just maybe because of the way the perimeters come in, but it does, as I was thinking through IDME, like I really have been thinking about, so what and how do we define the data that gets created? And it happens in Irwin, it happens in Inform for sure, because data is coming in from multiple sources, it gets combined and we're presenting kind of that one record or one incident type. We're trying to narrow that down, right? And that to me is the start of that process of going from agency data to interagency data, but it's like a really gray line. But I do think that it's, especially when I'm thinking about IDME, that we have the potential in that type of capability to create data that doesn't exist anywhere else. And we're going to be creating it from the interagency perspective. And it has the potential to be slightly different than the agency perspective. Emmy?
Yeah, I think it's, for me, a good example of that is when we create the jurisdictional units boundary. We get boundary submissions from Alaska, BIA, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, and the Forest Service, because they're the authoritative agencies for their jurisdictions. And they submit it up to the jurisdictional boundary that we're creating for all of the US, which includes census, states, Bureau of Reclamation, city, county, all of DOD, all other data. And we roll it up to one jurisdictional layer that's for our interagency use. So the sources come from the agencies, and that's lower. And then we roll it up. So I think for me, that's easier to see in the geospatial, those differences. But in that case, the agency is embedded in the interagency data.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example to think about those relationships, right? I think it gets a lot muddier when we start talking about multi-agency incidents, right? Like those, and when we think about, an IDME being able to combine data from multiple sources, resource data, incident data, weather data, et cetera, what that really means and looks like. Chuck, did you have a thought?
I'm afraid I'm going to butcher it, but I guess I'll try anyway. Some of this I see like in fire environment, we call this, it could be data assimilation or processing. So if you have a solid data stream of like observe, past, current, future, there's ways to stitch it all together using solid business rules and so forth that everyone could agree upon. So a process like that could result in an authoritative interagency data stream, various flavors for everybody. This means coming up with those rules and those things together is just kind of a little different approach. So hope I'm not totally confusing everybody. I'm going to speak to it a little bit tomorrow in my presentation. Data assimilation, bringing everything together, understanding it, putting out something that represents all of it that's better than the whole.
Yeah, I think the interagency data there's an aspect of that we're assimilating the data from individual agencies to create a different picture, right?
Yes. In some way, if we set the rules correct, that could become the authority for what that data is or are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who makes those decisions, right? And how
Well,
the
except when
process
you
is
have
run.
to, when you have to edit it, you need to edit it at the source rather than at the compilation.
Bingo.
Because that's when you get into trouble. If you take edits at that interagency level, it doesn't trickle down to the source data or the authoritative agency data.
Yeah, I think Irwin has been really, really good about giving us that pattern, right? Like we create that interagency data set in Irwin that comes from those agency authoritative sources. I mean, even though some of them are interagency, but if we just kind of, for the sake of conversation, right, set it aside and say, there's an agency system that's contributing data and it goes into this interagency pool, and we have these business rules for how that happens, which gives us a degree of confidence in how that data represents the interagency perspective.
Yeah, and it's easier when you're closer to those agencies, but the farther you get as you're displaying their data, the harder it gets because you lose control.
Yeah.
So like with PATIS, people want to make changes to jurisdictional boundary, and it's like, okay, you need to tell PAD US, but because if we can, kill ourselves every year correcting that interagency data, but it's never going to get to the feedback loop, which Andrew talks about.
Yeah. Okay, let's see, what else did I have? Oh, endorsed. Yeah, endorsed. So I love the work that the GSC has done where they have endorsed specific data layers. And I think that gives us an opportunity to trust some data, have some data that we can, for all those reasons we talked about authoritativeness, right? All of the value that understanding authoritativeness brings us. I think that idea of endorsed is really helpful. And I think that one of the things that I had done was I had kind of in my mind equated endorsed with authoritative. And I saw a comment from Julie one time in the informed chat, which is incredibly informative and helpful for me. Thank you guys for letting me hang out there. That made me go, oh, maybe I've made an assumption that is not shared in that endorsed means authoritative. And so it was actually really helpful for me to look at these definitions and go, oh, so there is a meaningful difference, I think, between endorsed and authoritative, but I'm not sure that we all have that common understanding. Andrew?
Yeah, I think I picked up the term endorsed when I was chair of the GSC, specifically because I recognized that the Geospatial subcommittee had very little authority. Who are these guys? Who's this group of people to be saying something's authoritative? So the best we could do was, as a group, endorse using specific data sets for specific purposes. So when we're interagency, the best we're going to be able to do is that jurisdictional boundary layer, because it's at least had the major overlaps dealt with, and we can rely on it for some level of accuracy. Where, PAD US, we chose not to endorse because they don't, while they assimilate data, they don't they don't handle boundary overlaps. They don't make a flat data set that you can do an intersection against. So we're endorsing one data set over another for a specific reason, for one specific purpose. And we don't really have the authority to say thou shalt, where agencies do, right? Within the Fish and Wildlife Service, when I'm doing analysis involving boundaries, I am to use our authoritative data because that's what my agency says we have to do. And they do have authority in my sphere. Anyway, just a little bit more on that. That was a deliberate choice to start using that word endorsed instead of authoritative.
Yeah, and I think it was a really insightful choice, Andrew.
Thanks. It's the best available.
Yeah, I think the difference, well, and so let's talk through that. Is there a difference between saying best available and endorsed? I think.
Yes, absolutely. There is a difference. So I was just, that was a little tongue in cheek. That endorsed was the best available term at the time because authoritative really wasn't available to us from our seat. But sure, if I'm doing project level work, right? If I get to Middle Fork was a great example when I was on the Middle Fork fire this year. That's a specific project, and I have, and while I might as a first cut grab the jurisdictional agency boundary layer, if I've got a little bit more time, I can absolutely assemble a data set from each of the authoritative data providers for, Idaho Department of Lands and the Forest Service and the BLM, and I can actually take some time to handle boundary overlaps, and I can build a better available data set at that given time. Or if I'm only on a Forest Service fire, I'll choose their boundary data set, and I might get it from the local forest rather than the national data set if that's the one that the local unit believes is authoritative or is the best available, excuse me. So yeah, I don't think endorsed means the same thing as best available either.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I think there's something in that idea that endorsed data is probably makes sense in particular instances, right? Like it's a good starting point. It is probably really good for national interagency type work, right? But that recognizing that when the opportunity is available to drop into more locally managed and controlled data, that becomes better and probably more authoritative than the endorsed data.
Even if it's not better, sometimes you have to do with what will be bought off on.
Yeah.
Because it's just not an argument you have time for.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, but I think scale does have a huge part to play in this.
Yeah.
I think so too.
So something could be authoritative and endorsed.
Sure. Yeah, authoritative kind of has this concept that there's someone there who can have that authority. And in the interagency world, especially interagency, when not just federal, but state, local, it's hard to have authority because it doesn't exist. We're in a federated system of government. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, that may be different here coming up, Andrew.
Hey, yep, it might be, but we're especially talking about land ownership data. If you go to another country, you may find that they have a national consolidated cadastral system. We don't have that, and so land ownership is almost never going to be authoritative. Can be within a county. Probably can't be at a state. Maybe Montana is an exception. Certainly can't be nationally. Who's the authority?
And
Yeah.
even those data sets are not necessarily, there's always a time and spatial error inherent in those data sets.
Mhm. I think one of the things that has been good is that this idea of endorsed data is primarily pointed at reference data. And I think that that is probably a safe place to start, in that we have a little more control over that. It's a little more static, right? It's not as dynamic as some of our operational data sets, but it gives us a space to really think about it. And so I've always thought about and looked at, like, are there ways that we can expand this idea of endorsed data beyond what GSC has done? Because GSC has always been so good at this type of stuff, that it's great to, that's why I love having the fire reporting subcommittee and the GSC under the DMC. Is, there's these great ideas that go back and forth between them. And so thinking about, endorsed data, and can we expand that to other data sets that we might want to be using that maybe aren't spatial, that the DMC or the fire reporting subcommittee or somebody else could endorse. I think there's opportunities within the work that Chuck and Fence are doing, and FEMS, right? That there's probably data sets that we might want to endorse for use in that fire environment side of the house. And maybe through things like that, we can like kind of slowly herd, like, you can't see me, but I'm doing this kind of like taking my arms out from the side and bringing them together, right? Like, so kind of funneling people into using the same data set by endorsing things that maybe then we can have more consistency in some of our modeling and outputs and different things like that. But I think that endorsed is a really great concept for us to work with under NWCG. Okay, so we're kind of coming to the end of the time scheduled for this, and I don't want to impede on Emmy's discussion, but I think this is something I think we should probably continue talking about on the DMC and see if we can kind of figure out what those buckets are that we would want to categorize our data and our systems in, and think about how we want to define that and give some examples for that. And, the thing is, it's like whenever we start having these conversations, it's really easy to jump into examples, and examples are helpful as long as we're being respectful of the fact that a lot of these things, to Kara's point, are things that have been in our community and our culture for a long time. And there were decisions made at a particular point in time that made sense at that point in time, right? And so the fact that we may have a different lens or a slightly different angle that we want to look at something through doesn't mean that what happened before was wrong or bad. And so we want to be really respectful of that and recognize that what we're trying to do is see if there's an opportunity to improve our understanding by clarifying our language and our definitions of terms as we go forward. And that may mean some retrofitting or some shifts from what we've done in the past. And that's just representative of the fact that, we're alive, and so things change. It's much better than the alternative. So, well, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate your engagement and participation, and I think we covered a lot of territory. And like I said, this is a little more relaxed in that I really didn't expect that we would be making hard decisions in this data summit, but more of starting some conversations and sharing some information and seeing what we can do together that may not be associated with modifying an application that we can't afford to modify anymore. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to you, Emmy.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome back. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Wildland Fire Geospatial reference data that the data management program is managing. We also call these layers national boundary layers for short. And just an overview, so these geospatial reference layers are known as national boundary layers. They're used across wildland fire for support planning, decision-making, and reporting. I'm glad I put this authoritative badge here because the previous conversation was perfect. These are authoritative at the interagency level, and they're critical in creating interoperability and consistency across our wildland fire IT applications and analysis. So they're basically foundational layers that we use across incident response, dispatch, and then a lot of the different applications in fire. So the first one, jurisdictional units, public, that's the one we mentioned earlier a couple times. I will just open you. So for all these layers, jurisdictional units, public is separated from the others, and it's a little bit different. It's over 1 million records, and it's not as dispatch focused, and it has a different audiences that develop it, and a little bit different in how it's used. For all these layers, you can get them on the open data site in the boundaries category. So you can go to ArcGIS Online or the NIFC AGOL and get them with your login and password, but they're also available publicly in this boundaries category. So if you go, I already have jurisdictional units open, but if you go into boundaries, with all the data layers, you'll see authoritative badge at the top, and then Wildland Fire Data Management Program. That's us. We're the stewards of the data. And then for jurisdictional units, you can see, this is behind it, but just a little bit of a background when it was developed, based on federal agency input. So we're taking all the agencies, the big 5 agencies, the inputs, Alaska, and also a lot of the data comes from PAD US 4.0. And our first release was January 2025. And then it talks a little bit about the applications that use it. And we have a lot of other metadata in here, as well as the downloads as well, and the services. So all of the data sets that the data management program oversees, and then the data national data layers have similar information to them, and you can get them all in that boundaries layer. So a little bit, so back to the layers. Like I said, they're available on NIFC AGOL or NIFC Open Data. We have them color coded, so all of these have public service view and a sync service for all of them. So you can sync offline, use the data. And then the national units public has a vector tile service, which speeds up the view and the loading time. So that's in red. So these, for all the data layers that we have the DMP logo, and it changes based on the type of service that it is. A little bit of history with these data layers. Prior to 2023, those dispatch related ones, which are the national boundary layers, they were managed by Jill Kunze through the National Boundary Working Group. So I think that boundary working group was under the Geospatial Subcommittee. And then so this was broken out, and I don't know who managed it before Jill, but the jurisdictional unit boundary was created and maintained by Andrew Bailey for many years, almost 10. And before that, it was Susan Goodman from OWF. So they were kind enough with their regular jobs, I believe. Were these other duties as assigned, Andrew?
Yep, they were.
Those were not really other duties as assigned. They were necessary to make WFTS work. And so they were part of my job. But they were a really big, like an outsized part of the job.
Yeah.
And then I'll throw in there that Diana Sampson actually managed those national boundary layers before Jill.
Before Jill, okay. We got to give Diana some props there. Yeah, in 2023, when Jill left, I took over the managing of the national boundary layers. And then in 2024, began compiling the jurisdictional units boundary. So 2023 and 2024 has been when all of these layers have become centralized under the data management program. And January 15th, 2025 is when we released the first jurisdictional unit boundary. And in that release in 2024, we had the first agency data call instead of using the PADIS agency data. So we take, since we have all of the agencies with us in our community and they have the best data for their own jurisdictions, we did a data call to BIA, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and the Forest Service, as well as Alaska. And we took their data directly from them, didn't take it from PADIS, and we plan to do that in the future as well. And then we also created a new feedback form for all of the layers. So at the bottom of every details page, which I brought up earlier, you can go all the way to the bottom, and then there's a feedback form that Amanda Rumsey created, which is awesome. And for the jurisdictional units boundary, you can actually use the form to mark up and edit what you want to change spatially. So there's and tabularly, and then for the other layers, it's just a comment on how to what you want to change. And then we also created new hosted parent service with all new URLs. So this is the only year that we're going to change the URLs. We sent out communication and hopefully everyone got it. We did the proper hostings, not that it was done wrong in the past, but it's a new method that Esri uses. And so we have one hosted parent, and then all the views can be updated from that one parent. So the user never sees that the URL changes because it doesn't change, but the data can be updated behind the scenes. And then more recently, we're updating the governance process. So we don't want to start any giant bureaucratic thing with these data layers, but we do need a better way to communicate and with the users and as well as the folks that provide the data itself. So we've formalized the governance process on these, and we're in the process of standing up 2 boards under the Geospatial Subcommittee, which is under the Data Management Program under NWCG. So the 2 boards are National Geospatial Boundary Board, which is more those dispatch layers, and then the Jurisdictional Unit Boards, which is created to manage the one jurisdictional unit's boundary layer. So even though we're managing both or all the data sets, it's not really the same people that participate. So we created 2 boards. And so I just put the primary objectives of the National Geospatial Boundary Board. Really, it's to facilitate interoperability, support communication and collaboration. And so people know like who I am, where they can, ask questions, where they need to submit their changes, and to encourage partner agency representation and participation. And the members and advisors of the Geospatial Boundary Board are the DMP editor, which is myself. And then we have 2 reps from each GAC, so the dispatch community, as well as about 2 representatives from the Geospatial Subcommittee, the Communications Duty Officer and Telecom, so that's for the initial attack frequency layers, and then the wildland fire applications, so Irwin, EGP, all the folks that participate in and use these dispatch layers. And really, I put on the bottom of this one and the next board information to ensure that the cycles and release schedule works for everyone, because we have the way that we've started to use geospatial services is different than maybe in the past, and it's becoming faster in the editing and the way we get information out. So we don't have to depend on the download schedule as much. I know we have to be I know Irwin still uses downloads and a lot of people still do, but maybe we don't have to be as strict on the edit cycle, or maybe we do. I don't know. We just need to get everyone together and figure out when do we want these to be updated Do we only want them to be updated in April so that everyone's on the same page and in January, or, you know, can it be more open? So that's the National Geospatial Boundary Board. And then Jurisdictional Units Board. So this is very similar vision or objectives: to provide oversight, maintain, and publish a timely, trustworthy, and authoritative interagency data set. To coordinate, formalize the process of the publication. So we really want to get folks to test it out before we release it, and understand like when that testing period is out, kind of like a soft open before we release the data set. And then a transparent process for validating. And members and advisors, myself, the Wildland Fire Management Research, Development, and Application Program is heavily involved in this, and is Amanda Rumsey is leading it, Jonah Vaughn, Susan McClendon. The four of us, we meet every 2 weeks and work on the data set. But we also need the agency GIS leads to participate, not every 2 weeks. This and all the participation will be by need. But when we do that data call every year and we need feedback and we have questions, we just want to make sure that we're constantly communicating so that it's not a surprise when the data comes out. And again, ensure cycle release schedule works for everyone. That's my goal. I want to make sure that, you know, I can do it anytime. I just want to make sure it works for everybody. So I think that's all I had. I just really wanted to introduce the data and where it's coming from and how it, you know, where it exists and where you can find it. I have some links here that we'll post, I think, on wildfire.gov. We have a wildfire.gov page for the National Boundary Layers, and on that page, so I think I can pull it up.
I did put that link in the chat already for you, Amy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so we have the wildfire.gov page, the change log. So every year we have the changes that we made. We put it out there so you don't have to dig into the metadata. But we also have the changes right there within the description page of all the services. And that National Base Layer feedback form, we have that. So like if you have, like I said, any feedback on any of the data layers, you can put it right in that form. So
Cole has his hand up.
Okay.
Hey, I mean, maybe I missed it, but on things like this, are you tracking that new datum change?
The datum change?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Because yeah, there's a change in the datum at least within the Forest Service, and I think the entire federal government, that's, you know, gonna drastically change some things. It's based on, you know, tectonic plates and all kinds of things. It's crazy. I don't know, but I mean, something to be aware of.
I'll look into it.
It's over a year out, right? Or at least a year out, Cole?
Yeah, I mean,
don't panic. Don't panic. Find out.
I'm panicking. I just took all the
but
services down and changed all the views and
yeah, but something to be aware of for sure.
Yes.
What is there any guidance on it, or is it just like this is happening in a year?
Well, I think the federal government has to adopt it by early next year.
Sounds like a topic for GSC.
Yeah.
Just trying to get awareness out right now.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that we decided to go with these boards is, you know, as Emmy alluded to, in the kind of the history of the management of these data layers, it's been kind of one of those things that, I mean, with the exception of the work that Andrew did under WFDS, where that was really targeted for an application, and so it was kind of part of his job because of that. What we've been trying to work towards with the data management program is to look at those things that are going on at an enterprise level and be mindful of whether we are asking an application to do something on behalf of the community at large, which is a model that we've used in the past and has been effective, right? Like we've gotten a lot done using that. But with the data management program in place, there are opportunities to assess whether or not that's the most effective way to continue doing that. And it seems like, you know, everybody has limited resources, so we just can't say the data management program is going to do everything. But it did seem like these layers are significant enough to the community as a whole that continuing to ship them around with, you know, somebody at an agency out of the goodness of their heart choosing to manage them, like Diana did and Jill did, right? Like we wanted to kind of formalize the process. And then the other thing that was happening is that Emmy was coordinating with a whole bunch of people, but it was like very dependent on them knowing her or knowing somebody that knew her. And that created problems for folks that maybe had some input or had some feedback, right? We wanted to create a little more formal way for people to interact with these boards and engage with the process and be able to ask questions without having to shop around for emails. And so that was really kind of the point of standing up these boards. It also gave, you know, going back to that conversation about authoritativeness, right? Like to have boards that had defined governance processes, then it just lends credibility to the value and the reliability of that data. And again, is part of wanting to promote the use of reference data that is defined and managed for the enterprise at the interagency level. And so, so that was really kind of some of our thought behind standing up these boards. The other thing is that, you know, we've been through a couple of these transitions, right? From Andrew to Diana, from Diana to Jill, and then Jill to Emmy. And again, that just seems really personality dependent. You've got emails that are changing for contact. And by putting these boards in place, it kind of provides top cover for the people that are participating in the process, and also ensures that people can consistently understand the process and participate in the process regardless of who may be leading the effort at any given point in time. So our plan is that we'll continue to have Emmy, a contractor that can help us with that, because it is a lot of work. And we just don't always have the resources within the government staff to do that type of stuff. And it's so critical. I've had to, you know, all of these data calls, right? I've kind of had to think about this particular data management support effort. And, you know, just thinking about these layers being used to create, to derive data for the incident records in the Irwin environment alone, you know, that's potentially 64,000 records or more a year that are deriving data with all of the extended team applications that are using this. And it's, when you start thinking about it that way, we can see the efficiency and the value that these reference data layers provide to the community as a whole. And just, I think is valuable and important for us to continue looking at. Don, did you have a question?
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, Rochelle, I think the folks that tend to get lost the most in the passing of the torch is the geographic areas and the GAC representatives, because they're not really, I mean, they're busy in their own geographic areas, and they don't know that Jill passed it to me and that now they need to send me the you know, their unit ID changes or their spatial change within their dispatch area. Even though, you know, we've tried to communicate, it's like we need to have that constant communication, that open channel of a board to let them, you know what's what.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that this does is kind of like, we have this interesting relationship, right, with NWCG and the wildfire.gov site. And I think that the data management program, I think, is starting to get a little more comfortable with it. And thinking through, like, where is it appropriate that we have something on the NWCG site versus the wildfire.gov, and where do we want to have the same information? And so what we've kind of done with this is the boards themselves fit under the NWCG umbrella. They provide that governance. It falls under the GSC, and Tony's doing a great job with that, chairing that committee right now. And so that is like the governance part of it, right? And then the data itself is out on the NIFC open data site, but we've got other references that are on the wildfire.gov. And so we're just trying to, like, essentially provide as many avenues as possible for people to find this information on the wildfire.gov site. There's links back to NWCG. Like, you know, Dawn's been doing a great job with managing that side of the thing, of the information environment. And so it's that's going to continue to mature. And but I do think it's important we realize that we live in this environment where there are just going to be multiple ways that people are going to access the data. And I think right now we're trying to cover all those bases between NWCG, wildfire.gov, and the NIFC org.
A shotgun approach.
Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, I thought it was worth pointing out one of the major changes in the jurisdictional unit layer. I think it was a change that I recommended. I can't remember if I don't think I got to make this change when I was still managing the layer, but we switched from using PADIS as the basis to, at least for the federal agencies, for those who are participating as part of the board, each of the agencies is responsible for converting their authoritative agency data set into the interagency standard and sending that over. That's a huge change that helps the agencies themselves take responsibility for the quality of the data. It makes that feedback loop way tighter than, hey, if you get it right in your agency data set and then send it to PADIS, and then we do the translation from PADIS right, that introduces like a long lag. This is a much more direct way and a model for some of these other data sets where if we start to get states participating or we start to get other entities participating, maybe BOR is able to join us. The agency's in control of how their data gets translated over. There's still this interagency process of reconciling overlaps that has to happen, and that's probably going to remain until something happens, at least at the federal level, that forces us all to snap to common points. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on your perspective, that hasn't happened yet. But I like this model of getting the data as close to the source as possible, manipulating it as little as possible, and presenting it as pure as possible. So great job. I don't think I can overstate how important a step forward I think this is for interagency data management. Thanks for the presentation.
Welcome. And I will say the data call from our amazing GIS leads was easy. So thank you all for that. You got the data in, and so it was great.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas that we want to continue to mature in the future. So, you know, the relationship with the states is one of those things, and Alaska is a unique situation in the way that they develop their layer. And so we have just basically taken what Alaska gives us and trust that they've coordinated all of that with the agencies in the state themselves, and we just load it, right? So we aren't really manipulating that at all at the national level. And so then we've had inquiries from other states. Montana, I know Idaho's been doing some work. There's different opportunities to look at how we engage the states with that going forward, and then balance the federal agencies' oversight of the federal boundaries with what the states are negotiating at the state level, which is, like, it seems to me like that should be the same data, but I know that there are census layers that have different boundaries for counties and states. So it's subtle, but there can be differences, right? And so I think that that's going to be an area that will continue to mature as the process solidifies. And then the other thing that is going to be kind of an ongoing conversation between the data management program and the data management committee is that idea of unit IDs. And so right now, the jurisdictional unit boundary layer has unit IDs associated with them. And when we publish that boundary layer once a year, the unit ID board meets on a monthly basis. And theoretically, there could be changes or updates to unit ID data more frequently than the layer itself is being updated. And so one of the things that we're exploring and talking about is how we can maybe manage those changes in a way that maintains the currency of that unit boundary layer, the jurisdictional unit boundary layer, with the unit ID data. And but we also have to be really mindful of how users are using that data. And so if an application is only going and pulling it down right after it gets updated and never goes back and checks on it, like then the changes are going to get shared equally. So there's some process conversations that we need to have about how folks are, how often they're updating or tapping into those layers, and what the impacts are when things like unit IDs change. Let's see. Jennifer is asking, how does the spatial fire planning effort coincide with the DMP work? I think that we haven't probably looked at that specifically. I think tangentially we have folks like WFMRDNA involved. And so they're coming at it from that WFDS Next Gen side and thinking about it from that perspective. And so it probably doesn't hurt to be a little clearer about how that works, but I think we'd have to figure out like how much of an impact that really has. But kind of what I would like to see happen is that we get these kind of reference layers, and especially these administrative or agency type data sets, distilling them down to the most atomic level and then being able to roll them up and use them in different ways. And so, and that just is an evolutionary process. And I think these layers we wanted to get good layers, and then we can start kind of looking at what other ripples are associated with that. Looks like BJ got Rebecca's question. So I think we're good that way. Anything else before we switch over to NERIS?
I'm glad we had the interagency authoritative discussion before this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Emmy. Great work. I know Tony and I really appreciate it. So.
Thank you.
Right. I'm going to pop over to Rebecca and NERIS and get an update on the work that they've been doing and their experience with rolling NERIS out.
Good afternoon. Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I actually think it's quite timely that we're touching on this issue of local data, specifically for fire department, service area boundaries, et cetera, which I'll talk a little bit about as well from the NERIS perspective. Let me move to the beginning. Okay. So in terms of NERIS, what I'm going to cover is just a basics on what is NERIS, what our system development and timeline has been, as well as our onboarding, some key features. Then I'll talk a little bit about what's coming in the future with NERIS. I would say if you have any questions, like feel free to jump in. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting because of the mode that my computer's in. But I think most importantly, I think since the last time we met with you all, maybe it was back in the early fall timeframe, the biggest difference is that NERIS is here. So we launched version 1 of NERIS back in early November, and we've been onboarding local fire departments since. So many of you may be familiar or at least heard of our legacy National Fire Incident Reporting System, otherwise known as NFIRS, which was really a 40-year-old archaic dinosaur of an IT system designed to aggregate local incident data from all fire and EMS departments across the country so that we can have an aggregated, compiled data set on all hazards, local incidents that all fire and EMS departments respond to. And so at this stage, we have around 21,000 local fire departments reporting. And as we move obviously throughout 2025, we are focused on transitioning our departments over to NERIS, which I'll talk about that transition here momentarily. But NERIS goes farther beyond the scope and vision that NFIRS ever was. So NERIS is certainly about capturing in near real time that all hazards incident information to produce incident reports, but as well as manage that data, enrich that data with other, should we say, best available, and in some cases, most authoritative data elements, and provide analytics as well as data services back out to the local, state, tribal, territorial stakeholders that use the system, as well as provide some publicly available information. So our mission and our goal is just that. In some of the biggest focuses of NERIS that we're trying to provide back to the local fire service is providing insights and intelligence on risk, ranging from community vulnerability information, understanding risks and vulnerabilities to structures within the first due area response of a fire station, looking at trends in code adoption, but also the enforcement of those codes inside a local jurisdiction, and then understand kind of looking at projected hazards into the future, including evolving weather hazards. And then understanding deployment against that risk perspective. So how are resources being allocated? Are we monitoring our staffing levels at the station level and against that risk profile, understanding station and unit capacity? In public safety and in local fire service, when we refer to a unit, we are typically referring to like a single piece of apparatus, not necessarily a jurisdiction. So just understanding that nomenclature difference, and then really looking at our deployment strategies against geographic areas of concern, special events, et cetera, and then bringing all that together for metrics on performance. So, understanding what response time is. So some of these metrics are already live in NERIS, which I'll share with you momentarily. Also giving insights and sort of prescriptive ideas around effective crew size and response force based on trends of incidents during times of day and times of year, as well as informing training needs where we might have gaps. So in terms of the NERIS perception, obviously there's the front end of the application, which is what people are able to see and touch and interact with. But underneath all of that, and what we have on the front end of NERIS is very straightforward, very intuitive, user-friendly, and frankly, it's really simple, and it makes everything that we do underneath NERIS really usable from a customer experience standpoint. But what we focused on is building out the data framework and a core set of standardized data schemas. That really is the foundation of NERIS, combined with our open solutions architecture. So those two pieces really represent the foundation. And then from that, we built out an API infrastructure that allows us to consume data against our schemas in real time from different CAD and RMS systems, as well as integrate other types of most relevant, best available data that's available across the community. And then it has an analytics engine that allows us to take all this data, synthesize the data, and provide back intelligence to our users directly through the platform. So fundamentally, NERIS is focused in these three areas. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but we're obviously focused on collecting that near real-time all hazards incident data from local fire and EMS departments. That data can come through as API connections from local CAD and or RMS, as well as a no-cost NERIS data collection app that we've made available. And then we have an environment in there, which I'll share in another slide, that is really for the data management, data processing, enrichment or integration of other data, and then the analytics engine. And then we have the sharing capabilities so that we can provide the data out in different types of services, different shapes and formats to the different customers that need to consume that data in a variety of different formats. So that ranges from our state fire marshal offices, USFA, and other federal agencies, and of course, local fire departments, as well as other consumers. So at a macro level, like, we're really focused on providing what we call, interconnected intelligence that empowers effective emergency response at the local level. But really that starts down kind of at the bottom and in that middle box where you see the NERIS data framework and API infrastructure. That's really what we focused on building so that we can more effectively tap into the available data that's out there across the entire ecosystem, what's available today as well as what's in the future. So by developing that open solutions architecture and our API infrastructure, that's really enabling us to really consume and leverage the most relevant, best available data. So that comes off of whether it's local CAD, local RMS, local GIS data. Obviously, we're looking at the NIFC data, different types of relevant satellite imagery, as well as other sensor data, whether that's coming off of ground robotics or drones, as well as different types of detection sensors that may be in and around the wildland urban interface or intermix areas. We're also very interested in the wearable sensors piece, different types of fire suppression sensors, as well as things like National Weather Service data, census data, community vulnerability data, et cetera. And so that comes together inside what you see the green box, and that's really kind of the core of NERIS. From a software technology perspective, that's where the data collection, aggregation, the integration, as well as enrichment of the data, management of the data in the analysis environment is, and then providing that back out as intelligence-led products, but also as data services. So we've basically built the version 1 of NERIS over the last roughly 18 months. Our efforts really commenced back in the late fall of 2023 when we started the development of our data framework and architecture. And we did that largely in partnership with our local fire and EMS departments to ensure that the development of that data schemas, the framework, the architecture, the governance, everything represented a national perspective. And then we also performed a full-scale national engagement on the draft data schemas. Just the first round of national engagement resulted in 1,600 comments, which we adjudicated individually, and has brought us to this version 1 that we have today. So back in March, so just a year ago, we launched a prototype version and onboarded 6 fire departments representing a variety of different agency sizes, types, as well as, environment complexities. And they really performed that first round of testing and evaluating and providing feedback on the prototype, which contributed to the beta version of NERIS, which we released in August of last year. And we onboarded another 56 fire departments that were onboarded onto that beta version. Same thing. They really, what I call pressure tested or stress tested the capabilities, helped us identify issues and opportunities for functional improvement. And then we brought that right into the development of the version 1, which was released in November. And back in November, we onboarded the first 173 fire departments, which includes those beta and prototype departments, as well as additional, to begin actually using the system to report and share incident data. They're using that today, and we are continuing onboarding, which I'll share with you momentarily. So bottom line is NERIS is focused on really that culture shift across the fire service of how do we get data-informed leadership to become the gold standard for the fire service. So we really see data as a living resource that captures and really helps to inform us on the full complexity and scale of incidents that we need to both prepare for as well as reduce risk for and respond to in our communities. And so that's really the underpinning mission of what we're working to accomplish with NERIS. Another big piece of how we're approaching this is we are focused on a risk-informed, risk-driven approach to how the fire service does business. And this really needs to equate to understanding risk and making sure that our resources and our capabilities within our fire departments match accurately a quantitative understanding of risk. So some of the core functionality that really sits at the foundation of NERIS is that it's a secure, scalable, cloud-hosted, and open solutions architecture system. So that's how it's built. It's built on interoperable, public, and standards-based data framework and API infrastructure for maximum data sharing. Hopefully, some of you have taken a peek at our GitHub environment and some of our Swagger docs and all of that, and you can actually see just how much we've made open and publicly available about the foundation of NERIS. And this also, the system by design is aimed at achieving incident data accuracy, reliability, and timeliness. Those three major issues were the Achilles heel that we had with the legacy NFIR system. That we had persistent problems in the lack of accuracy, reliability, and lack of timeliness with the NFIRS data. So we knew we had to prioritize those three key aspects and how we design the system to, in a sense, control for those factors. We also built NERIS on GIS and location services. So all of the NERIS data is spatially enabled, obviously not just point, but also polygon references. And then at the same time that we built out NERIS and the data framework, we also built out a data dictionary. So that data dictionary is available today publicly. We are working on some improvements to really improve like use and accessibility. But the point is we made sure that the development of that data dictionary occurred in lockstep with the development of the system. We focused on integration of data from best available sources. So here's the bottom line. If the data already exists from the best, most authoritative source, we want to leverage that data and wherever possible, reduce data entry burdens on our firefighters. So obviously our two key sources have been focused on computer-aided dispatch and records management systems, and which is RMS. And if any of you are tracking, we did launch an opportunity for CAD and RMS vendors to actually, in a sense, self-certify that their systems are NERIS data exchange compatible. So if you actually might, if you follow LinkedIn and that, you might actually start seeing different vendors actually publishing out the fact that they have received their NERIS data exchange compatible badge or seal on their product. So that's been going really well. That's really at a self-service. It's at the discretion of the CAD and RMS vendor. They're able to go in there and start that process when they're ready. All right, so data integration. We started off by integrating parcel data. That's been a major piece that we had focused on in the initial build. That's expanding out. We have publicly available parcel data as well as several other sources. We're also integrating people, places, and things data from a variety of best available sources, weather data so that our firefighters don't have to enter in the specificity of weather, and that can get captured off of the National Weather Service feeds. And then as we move forward, natural hazards, exposure, risk, and current conditions data will be integrated. So these are some of where we're working right now and building out. So some of the NERIS analytics, and I encourage you, this screenshot is of our most current version of our dashboard that's available for a fire department. And then obviously you're seeing like a national view of that right now. And this gives participating fire departments instant access to key analytics and metrics. NERIS enhances this data, obviously, by integrating with essential data, and this analytics menu for local fire departments is continuing to expand and improve over time. But I just want to highlight, like, you can see some of the information in here. You're seeing incidents by discipline, proportion of incidents, true, false. You're seeing incidents by hour and day, so we can see trends based on time, incidents by day to see counts per week, types of locations, unit responses, etc. All right, so the transition to NERIS. So for a fire department to onboard, we really focused on easing the point of entry for fire departments. And so it's very simple. It's a two-step process. They create an account. They can add and update attributes if they'd like to. And then really there's two ways for them to begin reporting. They can use the NERIS provided data collection app, which quite a few of our small volunteer fire departments are using. But if the department already uses a third-party RMS and maybe that's integrated with CAD, they can go ahead and turn on that connection as long as that RMS vendor has completed and received the badge for their testing. And then that data really just flows. So they can do their normal business day to day inside their RMS, and the data comes in automatically into NERIS. So our onboarding schedule, essentially, we will be opening the doors to all the local fire departments across the country in 2025. Currently, we are in the early adopters onboarding, so we just started onboarding an additional 370 or so departments. So that will round us out at about 500 departments by the end of April. And then starting May 1, we are opening the doors for all fire departments in FEMA Region 2. So all the states that are in that region will be able to start onboarding. And then in June, we go to Region 4, so on and so forth. So this is the schedule. We don't expect all departments to onboard in 2025, so onboarding will continue into 2026. But what I will share with you is that effective January 1st, 2026, all incident reporting by local fire departments will occur through NERIS, and there will no longer be incident reporting into that legacy NFIRS system. So this just gives you an idea of some of the onboarding information that a fire department will enter. So you'll see some, they enter in some department demographics. If any of you were familiar with USFA's former fire department registry, it's a lot of that same information. They also enter in their GIS boundaries, and this is the fire department service areas. So we're really getting truly the most authoritative, best available source for those fire department service boundary areas. For that department itself. Other things like station names and addresses, a unit and apparatus inventory, as well as CAD designations, unit types, staffing levels, department services, and other information around mutual aid, compact agreements, etc. So there's a few things, obviously, departments need to do to get ready for NERIS, which I won't get into today. And then this is really our outlook, as I mentioned, for the calendar year 2025. We're right here kind of in the early adopter phase of the onboarding process, and May 1 kicks off the broader adoption and national deployment. We will be through the ATO process on our end on July 1st of this year. We do already have a risk acceptance from our OCISO. And then, as I mentioned, when we move to January 1st, really of 2026 represents that full transition to NERIS. So NERIS tomorrow, one of the key things that we are working on is the development of what we call NERIS Open. So this is going to be publicly available NERIS data as services, focused on increasing accessibility and promoting open data. Open data includes the components you see listed over here on the chart. So core fire and EMS department data, fire department locations, fire station locations linked to fire departments, and fire department service boundary areas. And then we also have NERIS incident data, which is all hazards incident data shared to NERIS, all modules from the NERIS data schemas. This obviously is going to include, fires that start and involve vegetation as well, even though as always, like, we're not designed for wildland fire incident reporting. What is not going to be included in our open data products are any elements or attributes that have PII data in any open text narrative field. So those are reserved for secure data services. Also, kind of this brings to light as we work through our data integrations, as I mentioned, we're going to be focused on building a new future fire department fingerprint. And this is really going to help to advance the fire service in that mission of data informed decision making. So integrating the data with community demographics, early detection sensor data, current and future risk data, and bringing that together to provide NERIS intelligence, performance, actions and tactics and their outcomes, and helping to inform that future fire department profile. We're also looking at fusing different types of sensing technology for actionable intelligence and serving that out in a really thoughtful way through NERIS. There is a plethora of new and emerging, imagery and remote sensing data directly beneficial to our local fire departments that we're working to integrate. Those are going to come off of a variety of different things. There's obviously the fire sat data we're tracking, early detection sensor data, whether that's video data or sniffing data, as well as ground robotics. How do we bring that to make it actionable to our local first responders, and then also bring it to the state, county, tribal, territorial EOCs as well? And then we're going to be focusing on integrating our wildfire data and tools. And when I talk about this, I'm really talking about the types of wildfire data and tools that we in our local fire departments use in and around the wildland urban interface, the intermix, and obviously for urban conflagrations and structure to structure spread issues and connective fuels. So we have a suite of existing tools that we will be working on integrating into NERIS. And then we're also building out a national fire risk solution, which I'll talk about, as well as national wildfire evacuation guidance and tools and CWPP toolkit. Again, we are focused in the built environment and where our communities, people, and structures are. So one of the key areas that we are focused on as we move into 2025 is establishing a shared understanding of fire risk. I know this is probably, you're like, oh, well, we already have this. Well, we do have this. It's really solid for the wildland environment, but it's really lacking outside of the wildland environment. We don't have a basis to measure, understand, and predict fire risk consistently at the local level in and around our communities, structures in the built domain at large. So this is an area we are focused on. We just completed a national evaluation and assessment of existing risk models that, as well as data sets that touch inside the built environment. We are not reassessing wildland, and I'll be very clear about that. And we're making sure that how we look at this will be an ensemble of models that accounts for the WUI, the wildland urban intermix, connective fuels, structure to structure spread, urban conflagrations, and also single structure vulnerabilities and risks as we move forward. This will be an iterative process that we'll be working on building out over time. And with that, that's all I have for you. I welcome any questions, encourage you to keep a pulse on NERIS development as we move forward.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's really great. Like you guys had such aggressive timelines. It's amazing what you've been able to accomplish. I think one of the things that we just recently did, just as a point of awareness, we've got NERIS representatives on the fire reporting subcommittee. And part of that is just wanting to make sure that we have good mechanisms for staying in lockstep and working through things. So really appreciate you giving us Craig to engage with that.
Awesome. Yes. Good.
So anybody have any questions? Jennifer says it looks like it's a really impressive effort. Rocco, is NERIS informed, compliant, or connected?
Should be early, not informed.
Yeah, I think so. Part of what we want to do, and I think eventually Rebecca will figure out the relationship with whether you're getting informed data or Irwin data and some of that type of stuff as you guys continue to go. But it's it is, we're really interested in seeing the data that you have. That's what Karen Short keeps working on and figuring out how we can.
Yeah, Rebecca did give fire reporting subcommittee. She called me because they still have Forest Service on there, but really it's interagency. And I work for the Forest Service, but I'm always pushing more interagency because that's the way we deal with wildland fire data. But Rocco, we were able to weigh in on what they were looking at and our thoughts on it. And I think probably a handful of us did from the fire reporting subcommittee side.
If I can, I'll just comment on that. I don't know that I'd call it compliant per se, but we definitely looked at the informed data schemas as a part of the development of our data schemas for those elements that were relevant. And I think Rochelle and Stephen and I and a couple of others have, we'll continue to do our work to understand how we best connect the sets of data. We don't expect there to be a lot of duplication because of the scope of the reporting between NERIS and Inform is distinct in some ways, but there are some common fields as well.
Henry asks, can you point us to where your risk assessment is and the data input as part of it?
So Henry, we are building out a national fire risk solution. And so the data inputs for that are being determined, as well as the models that we'll be using as a part of that national fire risk solution. Right now, though, like even at the most basic level within a fire department, there's a fairly prescriptive way that local fire departments do risk assessment. So we are looking at that as well. And a lot of the data that NERIS captures helps them track that most basic level of community risk assessment. But more broadly, that national fire risk solution will be built out, primarily over the next 12 to 18 months.
And then is that going to be some of the data that you make available?
Yes. So the intention, and I don't know what that's going to be like when it gets built out, to be perfectly honest. I do have a vision for it, Rochelle. That's grounded in reality. I'll tell you that. But we will be serving out a version of the National Fire Risk Solution as a publicly available resource as well, both from an interactive user interface as well as derivative data services as well. So those have been some of the core requirements I set forth when we spearheaded at getting that established in terms of, and it is a priority for us. I'll tell you right now, it is in even the new administration's strategic priorities for FY25. So that is something that's moving ahead regardless of everything else going on. But yes, it will be both data services as well as user interface and integrated in NERIS.
Great. BJ, you wanna talk about the wrap comments?
Yeah, Timmons Group has worked with most of the stateside wildland agencies to develop branded risk assessment portals that involve the fuels, burnability, and all of that. And in there, specifically on the Minnesota wrap, and I think some of the other ones, there is the capability to do that wildland fuels assessment within the portal and generate an assessment product out of there for CWPPs. It was specifically built for that. So if you haven't already looked at those, I would strongly take a look at them because number one, there's a vendor out there that has experience with it. But number two, you won't have to recreate the wheel. I think you can get away with probably doing something like we did in Minnesota and add supplemental data and spatial data sets into the existing wrap and get a product that you want. So just throwing it out there, if you haven't gone too far down that lane, those wraps probably would help you out without having to recreate the wheel on a whole wide scale.
Yeah.
So
Let me be really clear, though. We are not recreating anything in the wildland space and for wildfire out broadly, right? Like, so that is an area that we know is well established and well developed. We are focused on the gap, which is where our mission is from a U.S. Fire Administration standpoint, which is where fire is within the wildland urban interface, the intermix, and in the structural environment, right? So
totally
I
understand
appreciate
that. Yeah.
appreciate you raising that, though, because that's exactly what I've been very adamant with the team to make sure that we are leveraging what's already available for wildland. You may be familiar with FEMA's National Risk Index, which has a wildfire component as well, which is built using wildfire modeling made available through the U.S. Forest Service.
Yep.
So cool.
If you want, and you want to request access to at least the Northeast Midwest or the Minnesota one, and just so that your dev team or somebody can take a look at it and whatever, that's totally available to you, so that and I wasn't implying that you're recreating the wheel from ground zero. I figured you were going to use existing models and all that stuff, but these are data sets that are already there and being updated on an annual basis. So
no, that would be great, William. Thank you for that offer.
I think all things, it comes back down to, definition of risk, which risk are we mapping?
Yeah. I think Steve has a question.
Yeah. Hey, Rebecca, this is Steve. So just on that point you just made, look, how does NERIS actually determine sort of where it starts and where other tools pick up? Like, how do you do that boundary? Like, is it, yeah, I guess that's the question. Is that fuzzy, or is that, is there overlap there? I gotta assume there's some overlap, right?
So are you talking about just like in general with incident reporting, or are you meaning in the context of risk analytics?
Probably both, actually.
Yeah.
Both.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of this, I'll start with like the incident reporting piece specifically. So that's always been, I guess you could say, fuzzy, because NFIRS had been around for 40 years. So we're not collecting data on incidents that we weren't collecting previously with NFIRS, if that makes sense. So we are not changing the scope of what incidents get reported into NERIS. That remains the same to what it always has been. So, there's always been incidents inside the WUI. We've even performed analysis on that legacy NFIRS data, specifically on WUI incidents. I can share with you some of those reports. So I think it's just what's coming up now, though, is that we need to be having more of these conversations to really understand, where those 2 points maybe have a little bit of overlap, right? And I think, like you and I spoke before, Stephen, I don't think it's drastic, right? The majority of fire departments that we work with are not going to be reporting into Inform day to day, because they're not dealing with fires inside those types of environments. So that's
okay.
where, yeah.
So it's really just a question of just defining it, probably a good definition.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
It's clear for us. I mean, for us, the requirement, I'm just being honest. For us, it's really clear. It's all incidents that a fire and EMS department, a local fire and EMS department responds to.
Okay.
All of it.
Fair enough. That actually helps. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's been the case, across the board of how we've been operating. So that stays the same. When we talk about risk, though, in this National Fire Risk Solution, we are really focused on understanding how to quantify consistently a shared understanding of risk, where we have built environment communities. So wildland urban interface into the built environment exclusively, right? We are not trying to measure risk in the wildland environment. And I will say we'll be inclusive of it. So if it already exists, great. But we need to address the gap.
Yeah, I think that wildland urban interface, that's really the gray area, right? Because from the wildland fire perspective, we're concerned about that wildland urban interface as well and how it comes out to us. And so that really is at different points in time, different, programs and administrations have really focused on that WUI area, trying to define it from the wildland view. Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew?
And I will just add, like we did last year, actually I can't remember exactly when last year, we released 2 different applications, map-based applications called the WUI Property Awareness app and then the WUI Exposure app or Community Exposure app, which I just dropped the link into the chat for those. We've been basing our calculations. We're using the NIST calculations for determination of the wildland urban interface to basically calculate where is the WUI. And I know it can not on a national scale. Now, this first iteration of the apps that we produced are good, but we're actually in the process of doing updated versions that are going to be far improved in terms of the quality of the data and refinement of the methodology in terms of the calculation of the WUI. Because it is calculated differently. Go ahead.
Yeah. Andrew had his hand up.
Thanks, Rochelle, and thanks for the presentation, Rebecca. Just looking to understand kind of what sort of data might be in there. Would you just, I'm wondering if there's an attempt at disambiguation, deduplication, or are we mostly looking at responses? So think of, I used to go to fires with the state. We'd have a fire that we would go to as the state Forest Service, but we would also have, 2 county fire departments from that county and then 2 mutual aid from across the county boundary. In NERIS, would that look like, let's say that the state doesn't report. We probably did report into the old system, but let's say those 4, is that going to show up as 4 responses? Is that going to show up as one
It's going to show up
fire?
as one response, one incident. So there's a few different things. So NERIS is capable of managing on the back end the complexities that we're dealing with, just like mutual aid responses, right? So we don't end up with duplicative records for the same incident. So they do match and bring those records together for a single record. And then the other piece is there's oftentimes incidents within an incident. So you can also have a single incident has multiple incident types. These are the things that are simplified with the NERIS reporting on the user side. And again, managing the accuracy and quality of the data itself. Those are 2 of the pieces. And I think it was, Andrew, you asked earlier, maybe it was something I picked up in the chat around the WUI data sets, right?
Wasn't me,
Okay.
but I'm familiar
Okay.
with the complexities of trying to map and determine and call something WUI, especially spatially.
Yes.
It's hard, especially based on the definition some of us are constrained to use by Federal Register and other legal requirements. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go out for the day, maybe eat out.
And I think that's one of the questions I do see in the chat, I think from Jennifer. I don't know that there's a single authoritative WUI data set. Basically, what we've done from the calculation of the WUI is we took the Sentinel land cover data combined with building data. And what we'll be doing in this next iteration is using the Overture, the GERDS data for building, which is an ensemble of data sets of the built environment, combined with that land cover data, and then running an analysis of the calculation of the WUI based on the NIST standard. So it's more of an analytic method of how we go about that. It's not perfect. It's not intended to be perfect, but it is a really solid starting point to understand the scope and scale of the WUI on a nationwide basis consistently.
And at least you can define a process. That's important.
Yeah. And that we have data for it now, and the data is getting better and better. When we started it, we just had the USA structures data, which is a FEMA data set produced by Oak Ridge. And now we have this much richer product called GERDS. I can drop the link into the chat. So that's going to improve. And then we also have sufficient data available now for the entirety of the US and not just the continental United States. So anyhow, we're working through this. It's exciting. It is important, though, when we're talking these WUI exposure calculations and tracking, these are not measures of risk. These are just general exposure of a potentially fire-prone area. So we're also being very careful in terms of communicating what we're looking at. If anybody's worked with me, I'm really adamant about not conflating exposure, vulnerability, and risk. So we're trying to kind of keep that through this process.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Really appreciate you kicking us off today and coming in and sharing this. Obviously we're very interested and appreciate all of the collaboration that we've had in the past and look forward to the future.
Yeah, vice versa. Thank you.